with that, I invite you, Dr. Kark, to take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Delighted to be a part of this conference. There are a lot of topics that one can cover when speaking of how Indian science forms the very foundation of what is modern science. And the chapter that Meg mentioned has the references and so on. And it's all based on scholarly papers that have been published by a series of scholars, both from the West and East, so that you can go and check on the references for yourself. Okay, now to begin with, I will just pick a few of the topics that one can include in this melange, if you will. And to begin with, perhaps Panini, because that's how I got into history of Indian science myself. Panini, when I was growing up, his amazing grammar, my father used to talk about it. And then in the mid-80s, there was a lot of work being done on machine translation. And the idea of Panini with his algebraic grammar was a natural thing to begin with. And that's how I finally got on my story of study of the Indian sciences, because the way Panini was described in standard history books sort of didn't make any sense, because we were told that he created this amazing grammar, and everybody acknowledged its magnificence, and people even called him perhaps the greatest, most brilliant man who's ever lived. But they said this was done when maybe there was not even writing in India. This is very incongruous. There ought to have been some background, and Panini himself acknowledges grammarians before him. And that's how I got started into analyzing different layers of Sanskrit literature, which took me back to the Brahmanas and to the study of astronomy and all that. But without going into all those details, now Panini is acknowledged as not only having created a grammar, a structure, which is mathematically equivalent to a Turing machine, which is as powerful a computing machine as you can imagine, because it has the power or capacity to generate all kinds of constructions in Sanskrit language, and a language is as powerful a system of productions that one can think of. And this has rules and rules about rules, total of 4,000, which is meta rules, which is what we have in a programming language also. So this has had influence, and in fact, not only influence on computer science, but also on sociology and linguistics and anthropology, because in the early 19th century, the French scholar de Saussure realized that if Panini could do for language, and language is one of the activities that human beings indulge in, or which relate what they do to what is permissible and what is not permissible grammatically. So he thought that that could also be a model for sociology itself and anthropology, because when you look at kinship relations in a society, not everything is permitted. So what is permitted and what is not permitted? And in fact, this is what led to the very development of, as I said, sociology, study of society, and study of primitive or indigenous communities, if I may use that term for anthropology. So that is quite significant. Now, the other aspect of computers, because, well, if we step back for a moment and see what is most significant about modern science. First of all, computers have changed the world. Second, they've changed the world by what they can do, how computation they can do, and it has two elements. One of course is programming. The other element is that of implementation of computation. And that takes us to mathematical logic. And mathematical logic arose in England around 1850s, and there were three Englishmen associated with that development: Charles Babbage, Augustus de Morgan, and George Boole. And so they came up with modifications to Aristotelian logic, which is context dependent, and that could then be represented in terms of operations that are performed on variables. And in fact, Charles Babbage is considered the father of the computer, because he tried to construct a mechanical system in the 1850s. Of course, there were no electronic devices at that time. Now, this was sort of forgotten until in the 1890s. George Boole's widow wrote a very famous essay, and George Boole's widow was a well-known science writer of her times. And George Boole himself died rather young in the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken. So Mary Boole wrote an essay where she said that, look, these three people get all the credit, but it's forgotten that they were part of a salon headed by George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India, who, according to her, was trying to communicate to this group what he had learned of advanced logic in India. And apparently what he was talking about was Navya Nyaya. Navya Nyaya goes back at least to 800 CE. And Navya Nyaya, modern linguists show, is equivalent to mathematical logic. So what Mary Boole argued, that what they had done was just to give a form, a symbolic form to something that they had learned from George Everest. When he would go during summers to London, he would talk about what he had learned from India, from his informants or teachers. So this then, and since the two are equivalent, so this is certainly an important contribution, foundation of modern science, where the genetic relationship in terms of the relationship of transmission is quite clear, as narrated to us by Mary Boole. Okay, now let me talk about a few other things. Chemistry, there's no direct influence of Indian ideas to chemistry, to modern chemistry, although we do know that in the Vaisheshika school, it was conceived that the anus, the atoms, could combine in different combinations, and that would lead to different chemical elements. But didn't probably go beyond that, although India was quite advanced in metallurgy as we know it, especially steel and so on. The Indian swords were supposed to have the best steel anywhere. But indirectly, Indian ideas did influence, because we do now know that Mendeleev's periodic table, this is Mendeleev's own admission, because he was at that time in St. Petersburg. Sanskrit was the most fashionable thing going on in the 19th century. And he constructed a table in analogy with the two-dimensional Varnamala table that we have of the Sanskrit alphabet. And in fact, when he conceived of it, he was able to, given there were many missing places in that table, he was able to predict some elements, and he gave them names such as Ek, Dve, and Tri, from Sanskrit. And later on, those were discovered, and then their names were changed. But the two-dimensional form gave him this idea, well, was borrowed actually from Sanskrit. And this is very well established. Now, perhaps the central idea in all of science. I don't want to touch upon the history of mathematics because Professor C.K. Raju will discuss that, and he's also going to be talking about the scientific revolution and how it's seen with the development of infinite series and calculus during the time of Newton and Leibniz, when we do know that all this was already a part of Indian mathematics and astronomy in the Kerala School of Mathematics. So I will not touch upon it, but let me talk about perhaps the most central idea of all of modern science. And that idea is firstly the discipline of quantum mechanics, and then the idea of complementarity in quantum mechanics. If you look at the subtlety of all scientific ideas, this is probably the most subtle. Because what is science? Science is looking at behavior which and associations across time to provide you how things evolve with time, and relationships between objects in terms of properties and characteristics. So in quantum mechanics, firstly in the 1920s, when there was a big crisis, and this crisis was owing to the fact that it was known that the center of the nucleus of the atom was positive, and the electrons which went around it were negative. So the question was, why don't the electrons fall into the nucleus, right? Because the attraction between positive and negative forces or negative charges. And this was a huge crisis, and ultimately Schrödinger was able to resolve it. And Schrödinger was a Vedantin from Austria, and he claimed in his autobiography that the central idea of quantum mechanics, that of superposition of different possibilities, came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman is equivalent to the entire Brahman. And since the, let's say, Pinda and Brahmanda, or Pindanda and Brahmanda, Brahman is so large, it is seen to be reflected in the Pind. Therefore, obviously, the conclusion to draw is that you're looking at possibilities which are beyond what one associates with the Pind or with the cell. And this is the idea of superposition, which is one of the two central ideas of quantum mechanics. The other central idea of quantum mechanics is that of the observer obtaining information about the system upon interaction with it. And this is seen in the framework of Vaisheshika Sutra itself, in Kanada's representation of physical reality in terms of, first of all, dravya, guna, and karma, between substance, its properties, and its speed. And what he said was, all the properties of matter that there are should be attainable by just looking at substances, their specific properties, and their speeds, which is, of course, an entirely modern, as modern a principle as you can have. But he also said, and Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras are truly very, very subtle. He also said that as far as the observer is concerned, you have to look at it from the triple or the triad of universal aspects to the properties of what you're studying, which is samanya, then specific, determined by your relationship with the object, which is Vishesha, which is from where Vaisheshika comes in. And thirdly, the samavaya, the interaction between the observer and the observed. And that interaction reduces or obtains for the observer some specific aspects of reality that exists, right? And this is the second principle in quantum mechanics, which is that when the observer interacts with the observed, there is there is a collapse. This is called the collapse postulate. There is a collapse of the state function, and the observer gets some of the mutually exclusive characteristics that are associated with the system, because what the system has is a superposition of many which are mutually exclusive, but as far as the mind is concerned, the manas is concerned, you can get only one of those set. So that is very significant. Now, the other let me step back for a moment. The philosophical understanding of quantum mechanics is seen through the prism of complementarity, that when you interact with the physical system, you can view it from many different complementing perspectives, most notably, for those who have done physics, from the perspective of the object paradigm or the wave paradigm. And there's something to be gained, or you see something from the wave perspective and you see something else from the object perspective, right? And they complement each other. In certain interactions, you get the wave picture. In certain other interactions, you get the object picture. Now, this, in my view, this idea of complementarity is really the most subtle, and it has the capacity to keep on advancing science, and especially now, physics is in a moment of crisis. But before I talk about that crisis, a similar complementarity is central in Vedanta. And since Schrödinger was a Vedantin, he must have clearly been aware of it. For example, when you do Ishavasya Upanishad, we are told that you can either look at reality from the perspective of avidya or vidya, or asambhuti or sambhuti, right? Avidya is materiality, vidya is consciousness, right? So these are two aspects. Materiality and consciousness are two aspects of reality, right? And likewise, asambhuti and sambhuti. In fact, as you know, in Ishavasya Upanishad, it's also stated that avidyayam mrityu tirtva vidyayen amritam ashnute. So that you need both. You need both avidya and vidya. That is what is complementarity, and truly a very subtle idea. Now, this idea gets reflected in the mainstream interpretation of quantum mechanics. As you know, quantum mechanics is all of these puzzles, such as the cat paradox. If you have not observed it, since a reduction of the state function takes place when you observe the system, so before you observe a system in a chamber where there may have been a breaking of a vial with deadly poison. So before you observe it, was the cat, if the cat was also in that chamber, was the cat in a superposition of dead or alive state, which seems sort of ridiculous. But hundreds of books have been written on this Schrödinger cat paradox. But in any event, in quantum mechanics, materiality and consciousness, as in Vedanta, are viewed as two aspects of the same reality. So quantum mechanics has sort of brought in one of the central and most subtle things of Vedic knowledge of the Vedas, which is Atma Vidya, into the framework, although most quantum theorists sort of pay or tip the hat to it, and they don't necessarily have all the other apparatus to go beyond just this recognition of the interaction between the two. Now, what I want to point to here is that physics or science has reached a point now where there is a huge crisis crisis of cosmology, if you will. There's a the mainstream model in physics and in cosmology is that 13 or 14 billion years ago, there was a primeval explosion where there was this huge fireball of energy which exploded, and there was a phase of very rapid expansion. And after that, this light, in the beginning, light then congealed into higher elementary particles, and slowly in a few billion years, you had stars and galaxies, etc., form. So this is the model, and people have been working on it for about 70, 80, 90 years. And things went along fine, excepting for two problems. One thing that's been observed in the last 50, 60 years is that, and you can now look at the stars and galaxies. And as we know, if you look at our own solar system, the planets which are closest to the sun are faster than the planets which are further away from the sun. Mercury, for example, completes its circuit around the sun in 87 days. The second planet is Venus, which does it in, I think, 228 days or something like that. Earth is 365 days. Then Mars is 600 and some days. And Jupiter takes 12 years and Saturn takes 30 years. So the planets which are further away from the sun travel slower than the planets which are closer to the sun. But now what they've discovered is that in galaxies, and in galaxies also, the stars are moving from the center of the galaxies, which are assumed to be black holes of tremendous mass, which works just as the sun works as a source of gravitational attraction to be the focus of the movement of the planets. So what they've discovered is that contrary to what one would expect, the stars which are very far away from the center of the galaxies are also moving very rapidly. And for that, they have to postulate some missing matter. And this is what is called the dark matter, for which, of course, we don't have any evidence. So, but they assume we can explain the movement of the stars in these galaxies by assuming that there is some additional missing matter, which can then explain this anomalous motion. So people have lived with that, and they thought that perhaps the contribution of this missing matter would be about 26 or 28% or 26% of the mass of the universe. Okay, good. But then about 22 years ago, they discovered that not only is the universe expanding, as had been understood for about 80, 90, 100 years, but about 4 billion years ago, its expansion began to accelerate, which is something that they can't understand. And now it's expanding faster than what it was expanding earlier at the rate of. And to explain this faster expansion, they are assuming that there is dark energy. And this dark energy is propelling all the stars and galaxies to go faster and faster away from each other. And the calculations have shown that this dark energy must correspond to 68% of the mass of the universe, because you can convert mass into energy. So 68 plus 28% is 96%. So for this 96%, there is no, not the slightest evidence in the lab that there is dark matter and dark energy. People have tried to look for it in different kinds of places, not the slightest evidence. And in fact, between the stars, there is also interstellar dust, which is supposed to be 3.5% of the universe. So taken together, that makes 99.5%. So current physics can only explain 0.5% of the observed universe, which is a big, big problem. And now, why do I mention it? Well, maybe if the ideas of the observer related to consciousness are pushed further beyond where they are stuck right now, because as I mentioned, people do in quantum mechanics recognize that consciousness and materiality are two sides of same reality, like two sides of the coin. But they do that only when you're looking at the axioms of quantum mechanics. When it comes to further development, the development of models looks at materiality alone. And therefore, should it be possible to bring in the observer in a more central place, it is conceivable that these difficulties will go away. And in fact, I can tell you that I have, by myself, although, this is, we are supposed to be talking about mainstream physics, and I'm talking of some more recent research that's been done. And in fact, 7-8 years ago, I translated Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras, and I was astonished that Kanada has the laws of motion of two of the three laws of motion of Newton's, and in fact, one in almost exactly the same language. Third law of motion of Newton's is, to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And Kannada has Karya Virodhi Karma, which is the same thing. Karya action, Virodhi is equal reaction by karma, which is reaction, right? So Karya Virodhi Karma, almost the same. Now, what is absolutely impressive, and this is something I discovered when I was doing the translation, and it's a pity that Indian scholars, Indian physicists have not looked at Vaisheshika Sutras, and I think they should. There's a lot of stuff there, because Kannada not only looks at the Dravya, he also looks at both consciousness and manas. Manas, as observers, we have manas, but consciousness, of course, is Atman. And what he says is that you have, of course, the 5 Mahabhutas, which is a recurring refrain in, say, Sankhya or any Indian system, speaks of 5 Mahabhutas, which are Prithvi, Apaha, Tejas, Vayu, and Akasha, right? And so he speaks of these 5 and many interesting elements to it. But he mentions that Dik and Kal are constructions, which is space and time, are constructions of the mind. So he doesn't equate Akasha to space, which is what a lot of people do when they translate from the Vaisheshika Sutras or from Sankhya. They say Akasha is ether or it's space. But that's not what Kannada says. Kannada says that Dik and Kal are separate. This sort of inspired me to open up the very question of whether space is three-dimensional. And there is a mathematical theorem which says that T is not optimal in logical representation, but E is, which is 2.718. And if you assume that space itself is, Akasha is E-dimensional, but space, as determined by our mind, is three-dimensional, because certainly mind views at reality as three-dimensional. So there is a difference between the two. The moment you assume it, you are able to then resolve many of the current paradoxes of quantum mechanics. And I've published a whole series of papers. You can Google it, E-dimensionality of universe, in the leading journals. And it also resolves the whole problem of both dark matter and dark energy. You don't need to invoke the two of them. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But the main takeaway from this is that giving a more central location or central place to this idea of mind-related concepts and reality, which is sort of beyond the mind. As we know, there is a distinction in Indian thought, in Vedanta, for example, or all other Indian categories, between Atman and Manas. Manas is classical. Manas is object-based, Our contents of the mind are object-based, so they are the same limitations as any object-based universe would have. And the contents of manas are accounted for by language, by apara vidya. But for Atman, because Atman is not an object, language cannot suffice. Language can only deal with objects, because language itself consists of abstractions or abstract objects. And therefore, for Atman, you have to go to para. As in Bhartrihari's classification of language, Vaikhari, Madhyama, Pashyanti, for ordinary language and abstractions of its meaning, but beyond that is para. So this is interesting. But let me also speak of some further connections that have indeed already impacted Western science in ways that most of us are not aware. In 1898, Swami Vivekananda was visiting New York City, and he was invited to a party by the great French actress Sarah Bernhardt, who was visiting with her troupe, who was visiting the USA with her troupe. And she invited not only him, she also invited the most famous scientist or engineer of those times, namely Nikola Tesla. And she arranged for the two of them to sit down together and exchange ideas. And both of them wrote about what happened in their meeting. Tesla wrote in his diary, and his diary is accessible now. And Vivekananda wrote about it in letters to two friends, and they have been printed. So you can access them if you just Google it. So in this meeting, 1898, circa 1898, Vivekananda tells Tesla, Tesla was the inventor of the AC motor. And prior to that, there was a race between Tesla and Edison. Edison wanted DC current to become the standard. Tesla had invented the AC motor, so he was pushing for the advantages of AC, and he won. Westinghouse adopted his standard, and in that sense, we are living in the age of Tesla. And Tesla was also interested in wireless transmission of energy. In fact, he spent a lot of his later years doing that. In fact, he was even able to conceptualize things such as a system where you're sending information remotely through wireless, something like what the internet is doing right now. So apparently Vivekananda knew the general drift, and Vivekananda told Tesla, look, it should be possible for you to show, using Western science, that mass and energy can be transformed into each other. And I'm paraphrasing Vivekananda. He says, if you do that, not only would you solve the problem that you are so invested in, but it will also establish Vedic science in the hearts of the Westerner. Now, we do know that Tesla was not able to do it, but one of Tesla's fans, because Tesla was the most famous Serbian of his times, one of Tesla's fans was Einstein's first wife, and Einstein wrote his famous papers in 1905, including the paper on E equal to mc squared. And his main paper on electrodynamics, now we also know that, was originally authored both by Albert and his wife. And it was only when the proofs came in that he took his wife's name out. But knowing this, what he also promised when they got divorced, he promised that should he win the Nobel Prize, he'll give all the proceeds of the Nobel Prize to his wife. So there was all of this stuff going on. There are many people who have suggested that perhaps this idea of transformation of mass and energy was proposed to her by Tesla. And there are some Western scholars who have assumed that, who said this. Personally, I'm not so sure, because E equal to mc squared was in the air, and there were some other people also who had come by this, maybe not in the most sound mathematical way. So I'm not sure whether that really happened. But clearly we do know in Indian ideas, because this you can read either in Mahabharata or you can read it in Yoga Vasishta, and I've quoted from here. It is said that when Pralaya occurs, the sun will become larger and larger, and the grahas, the planets, will fall into it. So it will become something like the red giant, as is proposed by modern astronomy. And then all of matter will become, all Prithvi will become Apaha. Then all Apaha will become Agni or Tejas. Then all Agni will become Vayu. These are like, the four main elementary particles, which is proton, electron. Proton is materiality. Electron is about flow. And then you have photon, which is about fire. And then you have neutrino, which is about decay. And this is, of course, also discussed in Vaisheshika Sutra itself. And then they're all absorbed in Akasha, and from Akasha they go into the Chaitana of the deity. Whether you're talking of Vishnu, the whole universe is then absorbed in Vishnu itself. So it's absolutely extraordinary. It's extraordinary that the extent of influence on mainstream science that has occurred. And let's also not forget J.C. Bose and his development of wireless, or his demonstration of wireless, and because now IEEE has acknowledged that although Marconi got the credit, and Marconi was the first guy to win the Nobel Prize, it was really work which had already been done by J.C. Bose. You can check that IEEE now acknowledges that that was the case. So really, all of electromagnetics and everything that has occurred, and J.C. Bose, as you know, was a Vedantin. He was inspired by Vedanta, expressly, and even his later work on life in plants, etc., were inspired by these ideas. So, what we find is extraordinary way things. Indian ideas have influence, which we can see in the last 200-300 years. But let's also not forget medicine. Medicine, the way Western medicine failed in front of the COVID pandemic, the fatality rates were the highest in North America and Western Europe, because they insisted on following the allopathic central notion of only dealing with symptoms or specificity associated with a response that has been confirmed in advance, and not necessarily by looking at the body as a ecological system. Now, as you know, there was the death rate in African countries was literally zero. The fatality rate in Nigeria is 15 a million. In the US, it was about 4,000 a million. In India, it was about 400. But of course, some people in the West do not accept Indian figures. They said, "Hey, how are we to believe them?" But look at Africa, 15 to a million. So there is right now in the field of medicine, people like George Ioannidis, professor of medicine at Stanford, who are calling attention to the fact that most of medical research is failing. It's not reproducible. And the irreproducibility rate is as high as 90% in many areas. So what happens is that a lot of research is done with badly conceived controls, and they are published, FDA approves them, and then these drugs are eventually recalled 4 or 5 years later on. So, but if you step back, maybe the problem is deeper. As I mentioned sometime earlier, there is a theorem that, mathematical logic theorem, that 2.781, which is E, is optimal when it comes to logical categories. But as you know, 2.718, which is E, is not an integer. If you look at integers, then 3 is optimal and 2 is not. 3 is superior to 2, much, much superior to 2. Now, Western medicine is based on binary logic, right? You have a symptom, you treat symptoms. Ayurveda is based on ternary logic. You have 3 doshas. You have the body itself viewed as a system which is in balance, and you want to make sure that it remains, or you want to interact with it in a fashion so that the sense of harmony is preserved in case there is a movement away from harmony. So that's the whole idea of illness and coming back to wellness. So this is, in my view, given the crisis of medicine as well, and the crisis also owes to the fact that there is a placebo effect, that about 30-odd% of the cases, patients get well just if they believe they're being given a medicine, even though what they're being given is just a sugar pill. So why is that happening? And it's happening because, of course, you should look at mind and body as one whole, which is something that Western medicine doesn't do. So in my view, this is going to be the next big thing in medicine. If only our Vaidyas were clever enough to talk about this mathematical basis, and also the great samhitas that we have, the Charaka, the Sushruta, or Ashtanga Hridaya. So to also, express all this knowledge in ways where an outsider can relate to it in an effective way. But this is not to say that we're going to reject Western medicine, because certainly when it comes to crisis, and we must also, in Ayurveda itself, also see ways of how all the new sciences of the past 100 years related to biochemistry and microbiology, which did not certainly exist at the time of Sushruta or Charaka and so on, how they could also be a contributing element to the whole medical framework. So I think this is going to be an extremely important element in science. And it is certainly known that Ayurveda did go beyond the Himalayas a couple of thousand years ago, and it's all demonstrated. It went to Tibet, it went to China, and of course the Chinese took aspects of it and incorporated that into their own framework. So as to how and what role it might play remains a very interesting question. Now, in the few minutes that I have, I want to also say that all of modern sciences are now reached at the threshold of what remains, what is beyond modern science, and that is consciousness science. In computer science, the question is, will computers become conscious? What is it? Where does consciousness come from? In neuroscience, where is the observer in the brain? In physics, how can we make consciousness play a role? Because we do know that observers interact with the observed. And here again, a very great Indian physicist, George Sudarshan, in the 1970s, with a student, came up with a way of showing that an observer, just by observation, can control or steer the state of a quantum object. But how can we go beyond that? And if we could go beyond that, how could we construct a consciousness science which is not just theoretical, which gives us a capacity? And of course, that's where Vedanta comes in. That's exactly what Vedanta does. Vedanta speaks of how consciousness, both at the level of the jiva and at the universal level, works. For example, in Mandukya Upanishad, at the level of the jiva, in the Jagrat space, you have Vaishvanara. In the dreaming space, it's Taijasa. In the deep sleep, Sushupti space, it's Prajna. And the corresponding universals are Virata, Hiranyagarbha, and Ishvara, right? So what are these universals? And how does creativity work, let's say, in the dreaming state? We do know, and modern psychology is also aware of it, that most creativity cannot occur in the waking state, because in the waking state, you're dealing with objects which are already a part of the framework. And for creativity, you have to go beyond the framework, right? You have to go outside the box. And so long as you're within the box, you cannot do so. And therefore, almost all autobiographical accounts of creativity speak about trances or dream or visions and so on, which in Vedanta, we are told about the Taijasa state at the individual level, at the in the manas, or the Hiranyagarbha at the universal level. So how can these be made accessible to the individual? Because so long as one is only working according to the samskaras that a person is part of, one cannot be creative. So how can one become swatantra? And that swatantra is the state of the Ishvara within you, because the Ishvara is that universal state, right? Which is when, to speak of the Mahavakya or this particular Vakya, Shivoham, that one is Shiva, that you recognize your own Shivahood. So how could this be made accessible? Firstly, to, if we are talking of it as an Indian knowledge system, to Indians themselves, because who are most estranged from this knowledge are Indians themselves, because in the last 75 years, there was a stated policy that all of this should not be a part of the curriculum, because, well, very many Indians also did not know what it was. So I think the whole question now in this effort, such as the one by Indica and other similar efforts, how do we, first of all, make it accessible? Because these are very subtle notions. And then how would a person be able to embrace these notions to then develop a means, if you can call it sadhana, to transform themselves and to discover all the incredible gifts that reside within them. So I'll just stop here, because I've been told that we should have some time for questions. I've already done 47 minutes. So let me stop here, and I'll be glad to respond to any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor, for that panoramic view on different aspects of Indian science.